Welcome to Micro-Digressions. Welcome back to Micro-Digressions. I hope this isn't your first time here. I'm Spencer Case, the host, and today we're going to talk about free will. I asked people, what have I not covered on Micro-Digressions that you want to hear about? And this was one of the top answers. You haven't done an episode on free will yet. And so I'm doing an episode on free will. Here to discuss that with me, I have got really bringing the A game here. I've got Steve Kershnar and Michael Huemer. And we're going to have Mike Huemer go first. By the way, this episode, if you're listening to the audio only, there are visuals. That's unusual. I've not done this before, but there are visuals that go along with these intro presentations from each of the speakers. And you'll be able to see those if you go on YouTube and watch the video version of the podcast. All right, that's enough for an introduction. I'm now going to turn things over to Mike Huemer for his presentation on freedom versus determinism.
Okay, great. Thanks, Spencer. It's good to be here. And thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about free will versus determinism, and I'm going to defend free will. I'm recycling a presentation that I've used before, so some people might have seen it, but that's okay. All right, so this is how I understand the issue. People who believe in free will believe that we at least sometimes have alternative possibilities available to us. So multiple different things that we can do, and it's up to us which is realized. So we have control over which of these alternative possibilities is realized. Determinism holds that there's only ever one possibility, which is determined by the laws of nature and the initial conditions of the universe, or the initial conditions of whatever physical system that you're a part of. Now, I'm only going to talk about hard determinism here. There's a view known as soft determinism that tries to combine determinism with free will. But I'll just assume that we're talking to hard determinists who think that there's only one possibility and therefore nobody has free will, nobody has alternative options. And so, there's nothing for you to exert control over. Okay, this is my basic view. I'm going to argue that hard determinism is insane and it's also self-defeating. What do I mean by being insane? I mean, basically, it conflicts with the entire rest of your belief system if you're a normal person and the practices of any normal person in everyday life. Right? That's insane. Okay, and why do I say that? It's important that the notion that there are alternative possibilities available to a person is conceptually tied to various other judgments that are extremely important and that are ubiquitous in human life. So the judgment that a person should do something. You say S should do A, you're implying that S can do A. And plausibly, you're also implying that S can do something other than A, that they could avoid doing A. And that's the only way that makes sense to talk about what they should do and whether they should do A or not. Or the judgment that a person has a reason to do A. It doesn't really make sense to talk about your reasons for doing something if you don't have any choice about what you do. So you don't have a reason to do A if you can't do it. But it also seems like it doesn't really make sense to say you have reason to do A if it's impossible to avoid. So, it seems to presuppose that you have options. Also, the judgment that a person acted rightly or wrongly. You couldn't have acted rightly in doing something if you didn't have any alternative available. It's neither right nor wrong if there just wasn't any other thing, literally no other thing that you could do. I don't mean any other thing that you could do morally. I mean that you were physically capable of doing. If that was the only... So it's not either morally right or wrong to obey the law of gravity. You wouldn't say, oh, you should obey the law of gravity, or you have reason to obey the law of gravity, or, it's morally right or morally wrong. You wouldn't say that because you just have to do it. There's no alternative. Okay. If determinism is true, there's never any alternative to anything that happens. So it never makes sense to say that anybody should do anything, that anyone has any reason to do anything, or that anything was right or wrong. Okay, also, the things that philosophers call reactive attitudes, these are emotions that people have in response to either their own actions or other people's actions. So these are feelings like pride, remorse, guilt, blame, praise, or gratitude. Those are all reactive attitudes. None of those things would make sense if people didn't have any alternatives available to them. So it doesn't make sense to be proud of doing something if that was the only thing you could do. You wouldn't really be proud that you obeyed the law of gravity or something like that when there was no alternative. By the way, some people misunderstand this type of argument. I'm not saying that it is impossible to have these attitudes if hard determinism is true. I'm saying that if hard determinism is true, then these attitudes are always inapt. That is, if hard determinism is true, then every time you have one of these feelings, you're being irrational. Okay, so when you have one of these feelings, you're presupposing that there were alternatives. You shouldn't blame people for things they didn't have any alternative to. You shouldn't praise people for things they didn't have any alternative to, and so on. Okay, what else? These are practices. These are things that we do that wouldn't make sense if hard determinism is true. Wouldn't make sense to reward people or punish people. Doesn't make sense to reward somebody just for obeying the laws of nature, nor to punish somebody for obeying the laws of nature, which, according to the determinists, is all that anyone ever does. It doesn't make sense to deliberate about anything. So it doesn't make sense to deliberate about whether to do A or B if you don't think that you have an option to do A or B. It doesn't make sense to give people advice. So to say, like, you should do A, and by the way, this goes for both prudential and moral remarks. So it doesn't make sense to evaluate something as the morally right thing to do or the prudential thing to do or whatever. So like if I'm giving somebody investment advice and I say, you should buy this stock, it doesn't make sense if the person actually is not capable of buying that. It doesn't make sense for me to give that advice, even though it's, it's not moral advice. Okay, and this, just in general, doesn't make sense to do anything for any reason. Okay, because there aren't any reasons if determinism is true. Okay, these are similar thoughts that were had by other philosophers before me. So Epicurus wrote a long time ago, the man who says that all things come to pass by necessity cannot criticize one who denies that all things come to pass by necessity, for he admits that this too happens of necessity. Right, so like you can't criticize the free will believers for denying your view, because on your view, they can't help it. Okay, this is from J.R. Lucas in the 20th century. Determinism cannot be true, because if it was, we should not take the determinist arguments as being really arguments, but as being only conditioned reflexes. Their statement should not be regarded as really claiming to be true, but only as seeking to cause us to respond in some way desired by them. Okay, now, these are not exactly my argument, but these are related to my argument. Okay. And now I'm going to elaborate a little bit more. So here's the problem with deliberation. Determinism is self-defeating partly because deliberation presupposes free will. Right? It doesn't make sense, as I've said, it doesn't make sense to deliberate about what to do if you don't have any choice about what to do. Doesn't make sense to deliberate about whether to do something that you can't do, nor to deliberate about whether to do something that you can't avoid doing. Right, which according to the determinists, it covers everything. But deciding what to believe about the issue of free will and determinism is itself a form of deliberation, which, we're presumably engaged in right now, right? Trying to figure out what to believe about this. So then so the whole process that you're engaged in when you're thinking about the free will determinism issue already presupposes that you have free will. So you can't coherently decide to accept determinism. You could accept determinism, but then it would be something self-undermining about it. You would have presupposed the negation of the thing that you're coming to accept. Okay, here's a related problem. Arguments are attempts to supply reasons for believing something, but determinism implies that there are no reasons for anything, right? Because again, there's no reason to do something that you can't do. And you don't have reason to do something that's impossible to avoid. It's not that you have reason to obey the laws of nature, okay? So there wouldn't be any reasons for anything. So that means that arguments are always mistaken, right? So any argument for determinism is self-defeating. You're attempting to give reasons for something, but you're at the same time saying that there are no reasons for anything. Okay, and then there's the rationality problem. Rational thinking, according to me, presupposes certain norms. There are norms of thought that are inherent to being rational. If you don't accept these norms, then you're not rational. So there's a norm that truth should be preferred to error. You want your beliefs to be true. You don't want erroneous beliefs. If you don't accept that, then you're not capable of thinking rationally. Or there's a norm that we should base our beliefs on the evidence. There's a norm that we should avoid contradicting ourselves. We should avoid giving invalid arguments or things like that. Okay. So all of these are constitutive of rationality. If you don't accept these norms, then you're not thinking rationally. That's part of what it is to be thinking rationally. But determinism implies that there's nothing that anyone should, there's never anything that anyone should do. So all norms are incorrect. So if you accept determinism, you're committed to rejecting the norms that are constitutive of rationality. And that means that you can't rationally believe determinism. Okay. You can believe it, but it can't be rational. Right, because I know there are people who believe it, but they're not rational in doing so. Okay, so my conclusion is hard determinism is both insane and self-defeating. I have more about this. I have a paper called A Proof of Free Will, which you could find on my website, which is at OWL2. Okay, do I have more time? I think I have like 2 minutes. So I do have another slide that I could talk about here, which is about how I think physicalism is insane. All right. Okay. So very briefly, here's how physicalism is insane. Physicalists think that all human behavior has a complete, purely physical explanation. But I think there's no reason to believe in unobserved events that don't explain anything that's not already explained without them. And other people's mental states are unobserved events to you. You can't see other people's mental states, so how do you know they have them? And so my claim is, well, you only know that other people have mental states if that explains something about their behavior that's not already independently explained by something else. But physicalism implies that other people's mental states do not, in fact, explain anything that's not already explained by their physical states. So there's no reason to attribute mental states to other people. So if you're a physicalist, you should think that other people are basically mindless automata. Of course, nobody thinks that, right? Even except for Daniel Dennett, perhaps, who thinks that he himself is a mindless automaton. Okay, so physicalism is also insane. And that's related to free will because this is a large part of the motivation for people who deny free will, right? Most of them are physicalists, and most of them just think that they can't fit free will into the purely physical picture of the universe.
All right. So now let's turn to Steve Kershnar's presentation, which is called No Responsibility. Again, you can see it on the YouTube version of the podcast if you're just listening. Okay, Steve, take it away.
Thank you for having me here, Spencer. I really appreciate it. I'd just like to say that both Spencer and Michael are fantastic philosophers and people. It's just an honor and a pleasure to be on there, to be on this program with them. And in addition, the usual caveat applies. This work is my own. It doesn't reflect that of any group with which I'm associated. Okay, so I want to claim that my thesis is that no one is responsible. In fact, responsibility is impossible. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with free will? Well, free will, you might think, is just an ability or the exercise of an ability that underlies responsibility. Really, free will matters because and only because of responsibility. So the real issue is responsibility. And so the question is anyone responsible? And I claim the answer is no. Okay, just a few concepts. By moral responsibility, I think it's just a basic notion. A synonymous description is someone is responsible if and only if he's at for praise and blame. But I think that doesn't analyze it. It's just another way of restating it. A person's character state is just his psychology. That is all of his mental states and the relations between them. A person makes a choice. And I'm going to use choice and decision interchangeably. A person makes a choice when he cuts off deliberation and generates an intention. Now, the key notion of my argument is going to be that of a basic responsibility maker. A basic responsibility maker is something that by itself makes someone responsible. And we have the notion of epistemic foundationalism. Epistemic foundationalism says that some justified beliefs are not justified by another justified belief. Rather, they're self-justified. Think about Descartes' notion, I think, therefore I am. Or it's justified by something that is not itself a justified belief. For example, perception. Okay, so 5 notions: moral responsibility, which I'm just going to refer to as responsibility, character state, choice, basic responsibility maker, or the foundation of responsibility, and epistemic foundationalism. Okay, and my interest is in responsibility in terms of accountability. That is, responsibility as it relates to praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. When we should hold people accountable is a separate issue. And I think when we should hold people accountable depends on when they are, in fact, accountable. Okay, so what's my argument? My argument here is that if an individual is morally responsible, then there's a basic responsibility maker. That is, there's some feature or event regarding the person that by itself makes him morally responsible. But premise 2, there is no basic responsibility maker, hence an individual is not morally responsible. And that applies to all individuals. It applies to all human beings, it applies to God, it applies to every individual in every possible world. So it's a very strong thesis, okay? Mike would say, we're definitely into the land of insanity. Fair enough. Let's go back to premise 1. Why think that if an individual is responsible, then there's a basic responsibility maker? Well, there's only a few candidates here for how we could see responsibility. We could have a basic responsibility maker, that is a foundation, or we could have an infinite series of things, each of which gets responsibility for the preceding thing, or we could have a circular theory of things, each of which is responsible because of what comes before it. Well, the problem with the infinite series and the circular series is that nothing adds responsibility to the system. By analogy, think about an infinite sequence of extrinsically valuable things. You can't have an infinite sequence of extrinsically valuable things because nothing would add value to the system. Rather, you need something of intrinsic value that's going to make the extrinsically valuable things extrinsically valuable. So, think about if you have an infinite series of extrinsically valuable things, there's nothing that's going to add value to the system. But if you have something that's intrinsically valuable and it leads to later extrinsically valuable things, that can make those intrinsically valuable things extrinsically valuable. Same thing with moral responsibility. You have an action which flows from a choice, which flows from a character state, which flows from a preceding choice, which flows from a character state, and let's say infinitely far back. If there's nothing which makes an individual responsible at any one point in this sequence, the individual is not going to be responsible. In the same way that if you have an infinite chain of extrinsically valuable things, there's going to be nothing in the sequence that adds value to the system. All right. So what is the plausible basic responsibility maker? That is, what is it that by itself makes someone responsible? Well, I think there are only 4 plausible options. And the options are a choice which doesn't flow from a character state. That is, it doesn't flow from someone's psychology. A choice which does flow from someone's psychology, but the person is not responsible for the psychology. A character state itself, or a psychology, I'm using character state and psychology interchangeably, which is unchosen, and a character state which is chosen, but the person is not responsible for the choice. And I think we can see that none of these are going to be basic responsibility makers. Take the choice which doesn't result from a character state. Well, the choice is unconnected to the person's character or their psychology. It's kind of like a random choice, and you can't be responsible on the basis of a random event. What about a choice that results from a character state when the person's not responsible for that state? Well, I think intuition tells us that the person is not responsible for a choice that flows immediately from a character state for which the person is not responsible. So consider a manipulated being. Imagine that Patty Hearst is brainwashed. Now there's an issue whether Patty Hearst was actually brainwashed, but imagine she was like neurosurgically brainwashed or strongly hypnotized in a way in which you'd see in a cartoon or in a movie. It doesn't seem that a person is going to be responsible if a mere moment after they're manipulated, the person makes a decision. If they're not responsible for the psychology, the manipulated psychology, they're not going to be responsible for the choice that flows from it. And this is not just true for manipulation, it's also going to be true for an instant being. If you can imagine that God creates a person out of nothing, creates a person ex nihilo, instant beings like a manipulated being, again, they're not responsible for having their psychology. It's a little bit hard to see why they would be responsible for a choice that immediately flows from it. What about a character state? Can the person be responsible for an unchosen character state? No, because they lack control over it. And again, we can see this by just consider our intuitions of a manipulated being or an instant being. What about a character state which the person chose, but he's not responsible for the choice? The choice itself was manipulated. Again, the person seems to lack deep control over the character state. For while he did choose it, it wasn't a meaningful or controlled choice in any deep sense. And again, the analogy would be with regard to manipulation or an instant being. Please note that none of this has anything to do with determinism, right? It's beside the point whether or not the choice flows probabilistically or indeterministically from the character state, or whether it flows deterministically. Okay, so again, to see these examples, I'll consider the case of Patty Hearst. A psychology might come about through manipulation. Various mechanisms from brainwashing, hypnosis, or neurosurgery can create or prioritize desires and values. The mechanism by which this interference occurs and the alignment of the different desires and values could even be responsible to reasons, and yet because the person did not, let's say, control her psychology or did not control the psychology that led to the choice, she would not be responsible. Okay, so the analogy here is if you consider a choice which didn't result from a character state, that would be an analogy would be like a self-justified belief. A belief that's justified, it's intrinsically justified, right? It's justified because it's self-evident. And if you think about a choice that results from a character state when the person's not responsible for the character state, this would be analogous to a belief which is justified by something that is not itself a justified belief. For example, a foundational belief which is justified by a perception. An example, the first would be Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And the second would be a duck rabbit that would justify belief even though it's based on a perception. Okay, so I just want to cover a few objections. One might think that the basic responsibility maker, that this commits the fallacy of composition. That is the sequence of acts, choices, and character states is what makes them responsible, not any point in the sequence. But this seems to be a mistake in two ways. One, there's nothing about the sequence that makes it the basic responsibility maker, nor is there anything which cuts off the sequence. That is, why would the sequence be infinitely long? Okay, and just one more objection. So again, we return to what is the fundamental responsibility maker. I claim that it's neither a choice nor the character state. And I think this is true whether or not you think determinism is true, and whether or not you think the libertarian position on free will is true. That is, you can be a libertarian about a free will, you can be an agent causation theorist, and yet still there's no basic responsibility maker. And without a basic responsibility maker, no one's responsible. Thank you.
All right, Mike, I wanted to ask a question about your presentation. So I guess we're both very much on team realist. You know, we both think there are objective moral truths, and I want to know if you would abandon moral realism if you came to see that hard determinism were true, like, or would you move to some kind of soft determinism? Would you revise your idea of what kind of control we need over our actions if the alternative was like moral error theory? Because to me, I think like the position on free will is negotiable. What kind of control we need to have over our actions in order to count as, you know, morally responsible or evaluatable morally in some sense, I think that's not so clear. But you seem to think it requires free will, libertarian free will. Could you explain?
Well, so I think you asked, like, what would I say if I came to think hard determinism was true? But so first, if I came to think determinism was true, then I would revise my account of the requirements of free will, and I would become a soft determinist. Now, I think there are good arguments against compatibilism, but I would have to conclude that I was wrong about that if I was convinced that determinism was true. But then, you know, if somehow I became convinced that no, actually hard determinism is true, so nobody has free will, so there would still be good and bad. So axiological concepts are okay, but I think deontic concepts would have to go out. So there wouldn't be anything anyone should or shouldn't do. Not really sure how to avoid that. And I mean, I think that if you come up with a way of avoiding that, that's basically compatibilism again. Right? You know, okay, which is not as bad as hard determinism. So.
So you think so like Mark Twain in the book, I think it's Essays on Man. I think that's his philosophy dialogue book. I don't know why this doesn't get talked about as much, but he has a character that's clearly him that's putting forward this view that, like, look, people are machines, but you can evaluate machines. Some of them function well, some of them function poorly. And he seems to think like this captures everything we need about moral evaluation. Well, whereas you would say, no, you would get some of it, but you'd be missing the actual reasons. You'd be missing actual reasons. You could say that's fortunate, but not the.
Yeah. So that's right. You can evaluate machines as functioning well or poorly, right? So that's an axiological evaluation, right? It's good. Okay, it's leading to good states of affairs or not. And now you might think, oh, well, do we need deontic evaluations at all? Well, I don't know. Like when you give advice to people, you're using the concept should. You're not just saying something's good or bad. We use these concepts when you want to punish someone, right? You want to praise or blame someone. So it's widely accepted that it's unjust to punish somebody who doesn't deserve punishment. And so even if that would achieve good results, okay. So like, you know, let's say, so like this is sometimes said, oh, no, we don't need free will to explain our practices because like punishing criminals still produces a debt or something. Okay, and you know, also incapacitates the criminal, blah, blah. So it produces benefits even if the person didn't deserve punishment, okay? But almost everyone, like if you give this example, almost everyone will see that's not right. So suppose that you have a crime that was committed by someone and you can't find the actual criminal, but you can find an ex-convict who was recently released who has committed similar crimes in the past. You have no reason to think that he did this one, but he has committed similar crimes, so he is at risk of committing other crimes in the future. So you could frame that guy and put him in prison for the crime, and that will deter crimes because other people will think that he did it. So that will, right, it will produce the same deterrent effect as if he actually did it. And also it will produce the same incapacitation benefit of punishment. Okay, but almost everyone agrees that you can't do that, right? And so that's just showing that we are using this notion of people being blameworthy or praiseworthy, right? It does make a difference to how you treat people.
Spencer, do you mind if I just follow up on your question?
By all means.
So I don't really understand why, if determinism is true, things are good and bad. I mean, good or bad compared to what? So I'm reminded of Henny Youngman's question when someone says, how is your wife? And he says, compared to what? So when you say like this result have good results, it would have good general specific deterrence or incapacitation, I'm tempted to say compared to what? Determinism knocks out should statements and rightness reasons. Why doesn't it also knock out goodness or goodness reasons?
Is this part of your general war on counterfactuals?
No, it's not. It's my way to say that Michael Huemer's excellent attack on determinism is completely devastating. If it takes out the right, it takes out the good. So it's completely independent of counterfactuals. It's just saying the notion that you can get consequentialist reasoning under determinism is every bit as mistaken as the notion that you could get non-consequentialist under determinism reading. Determinism is a lawnmower; it mows it all down.
Okay, so you wouldn't have consequentialist reasons for action because there'd be no reasons for anything. Okay, but there could still be good and bad states of affairs. Now, it sounded like you were maybe advancing an intrinsically comparative conception of good and bad, that good just means better than the alternatives or something. But I was thinking that good is just an intrinsic property of things. It's just a degree of goodness that a state of affairs has. And so it doesn't have to be compared to something else to have that property.
So I agree with you, but I do think that that's not true if we're deciding which action to take. If we're deciding which action is better than another action, then I do think we need a comparative state of affairs, even though I agree with you, things are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad.
Yeah, if you're saying an action is better than another action, then yes, you're making a comparison. Although, by the way, you could be comparing actions, not all of which are possible. So, so it's not necessarily a mistake to say this action that we had to do is better than some other action that we couldn't have done. If we could have done this other thing, it would have been worse. I guess that could be.
Oh, so I'm curious with regard to libertarianism. Now, as you're well aware, I mean, you've addressed this. There's the problem of the luck argument, which is that up until in which the point at which the person acts under a libertarian theory, even when you hold every one of the person's thoughts, decisions, intentions, everything fixed up to the point he acts, the person can zig or he can zag. So if we do Peter Van Inwagen's rollback scenario, if we roll back the situation 1,000 times, 500 times the person does the good thing, he rescues the person drowning in a shallow pond, and 500 times he hurries off to work so as not to get his suit dirty. Let's say it's the wrong thing. And we say, okay, well, what about the individual explains why, let's say in the actual world, he goes into the pond and saves the drowning, let's say it's a drowning child. And someone says, well, look, I mean, he has these motivations. And you say, okay, well, but the motivations don't explain why he saved the woman rather than going off to work. And someone says, well, what you're missing is a contrastive explanation. Now, I gather you don't think the contrastive explanation is needed, but I'm not sure why the contrastive explanation isn't at the heart of responsibility. And without a contrastive explanation, what is it that makes her praiseworthy for saving the child in the shallow water rather than rushing off to work?
I mean, what makes a person praiseworthy is their free choice. So that is that they freely chose to do it, on this occasion.
But on what basis did they make the free choice, right? Just that they made the free choice is not enough. Why did they decide to act on their altruistic reason rather than the selfish reason? Given that when we roll back the scenario 500 times, there's nothing about the individual, nothing about her psychology, which explains why she saves the individual versus rushes off to work. That is, other than the mere fact that she makes the choice, what about her is the difference maker?
Yeah, see, I think that you're presupposing the denial of the libertarian view, right? There is nothing about her that made her do that. There's no answer to why she did it other than she just chose to do that, right? So there isn't some other property of her that made her do that rather than the other thing, right? And if there was, then you would say that she wasn't responsible for it. So, like, what do you want?
I want a contrastive explanation, and I want to make two claims. One that makes
your requirements for responsibility are impossible. There has to be a contrastive explanation, but if there was one, then you would say that she wasn't responsible.
Well, but in contrast, your explanation of why she's responsible rests on pure randomness or arbitrariness. That is, there's nothing about her that explains why she does the altruistic act rather than the selfish act. And if you say there's nothing about her that explains the difference, then that can't be what makes her praiseworthy.
Nothing but the free choice, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think, so, yeah, why is it not a random event? Well, it's not a random event because it's under her control by definition, because she's the one who caused it. Right? That's the whole like agent causation point of view, right? And, random events like in quantum mechanics are not under anyone's control. Like when the radioactive atom randomly decays, it doesn't have control of that. Like it didn't decide to do that or whatever. Okay. And if you think about, what else could it be? Like, what is it that we want? Like what could it possibly be that you're looking for when you're thinking about somebody doing something for you?
What I wanted to flow from her psychology and for her to control it. I claim in this case, neither is present. It neither flows from her psychology because 50% of the time she doesn't do that. Nor does she control it because there's nothing about her that explains why she saves the child rather than rush off for work. So my claim is you need both control, connection and control, but in this case we have neither. So if you need at least one, I think what we're missing here is one of three types of explanations. Either an explanation as to why this decision occurs, and an explanation as to why she's the agent in this case, in a developed sense of agency, or the third and most important, why she's praiseworthy or blameworthy for making her choice.
One way of, I think, getting at Steve's point is think really carefully about like the Patty Hearst case or a manipulation case of a different kind. It could be a case of extreme duress of some kind where you might want to say that a person's hand is forced or something. So they're not fully responsible for this in that case. Okay. Why? Well, in that case, you don't want to say that, well, it's just the person's decision. It's their decision. No, there are other influences on that decision that make it unfree. Oh, then you get the regress problem because where does the character come from? And if you can say it in a manipulation case, I think you can say it in a normal case where the manipulation is our genes and our environment combined or something like that.
Yes. Well, but so, I mean, with this, like Stephen said that, what he wanted was for the action to be connected to the person's character, but that's not what he wants, because if it's connected to the person's character, he'll say that they weren't responsible for it. No matter what happens, he's going to say that they weren't responsible for it.
Well, what do you say? What do you say in the Patty Hearst case?
Well, like why it's not free? Because it has external causes or something like that.
And our actions don't normally have external causes.
Right. So I'm not totally sure what we're supposed to imagine with Patty Hearst, but if we're supposed to imagine that it's determined that she does whatever, the bank robbery or something, then, she didn't have alternative possibilities available, so she's not free. If it wasn't determined, then she's going to have some degree of free will. Right. But by the way, there could be degrees of free will depending on sort of like how hard it is for the person to resist their temptations or resist the external influences. There are always influences on your decision, but, let's say in the favorable cases, you're still making a decision.
That's interesting. I would have thought that freedom is a binary. You're either free or you ain't. And if I submit to a very, very strong temptation, I've still freely submitted to the temptation. I would have thought that was what you would want to say.
Well, but I mean, don't you have the feeling like, there are cases of more and less free actions? So, like the person who committed a crime, but like they were on drugs, right?
I think there would be greater excuses that would apply to the free actions. I'm not sure what would be gained in saying it's more or less free.
I mean, so, like intuitively they get like a diminished punishment or something because of, quote, diminished responsibility, right?
Is that not just an awkward way of saying that there's an excusing factor that applies to them?
Yeah, can I just add to that, Spencer? Why is the case that the drug addicted person has just as much a libertarian free will, let's say agent causation free will, but they're less reasons responsive? That is why I think that the the reason we sort of we give them a partial excuse maybe is because of free will rather than something else like reasons responsiveness or mesh between their various desires and action.
Well, I mean, plausibly, those are just part of free will, right? And okay, I don't know, like how are we using free will? But it's supposed to be connected to responsibility, and so if you have diminished responsibility, then it's plausible that you had diminished freedom. I think they're just sort of like an intuitive sense that you could be more free. You get rid of the drugs. You become more self-aware, like you become aware of the psychological influences that are operating on you, so that you can deliberate about whether you want to be influenced by these things or not. And then intuitively, you're kind of more free and more in control. Right now, you might wonder, like, well, could there, like the condition, the alternative possibilities condition, like how could that come in degrees? Because it's just there are alternative possibilities, and if there's at least two possibilities, then you satisfy that condition. It can't be degrees. But it does seem like the self-control condition comes in degrees. There's a degree to which you're controlling yourself.
So is your answer to Steve's argument, we can call it the find the responsibility maker challenge? Your answer to that is it's the free action.
Yeah, the free choice.
And character is only relevant here if it is so much that it rules out the possibility of free choice. So the free action is the responsibility maker, and it's not random because it's caused by the agent. It's not explained by anything else.
That's right. Yeah. Does that sound good?
Well, I have to respectfully disagree. I mean, imagine that the choice doesn't flow from the character state at all. I mean, what stops it from being like a random choice? And randomness can't be what makes him responsible. Let's assume that the character influences but doesn't necessitate or doesn't guarantee the choice. That is, something else comes in. Well, what else would come in? I mean, what else would come in that connects the person to the choice? I'm just like, let's say that their whole character seems to, 99% support altruistic activity, but instead the person does something incredibly selfish. And we say, okay, well, they're responsible because they made a choice. It was influenced, but not necessitated by the character. And you're like, okay, but what did they add above and beyond? I mean, what would explain why they made that choice?
Yeah. See, I feel like you're stuck in the event causation paradigm where only events or states of affairs cause things. And, you have to get out of it and accept the idea of the agent causing something else. All right. So you're like, oh, so what is this other factor that's coming in besides the character? The answer is the agent. That is you, right? You're the thing that made the difference, right? And when you put it that way, it does sound like then you're responsible for it.
I thought there's something peculiar in the way you said that, like connecting the person to his actions. It's like, no. If you think those two need to be connected, you're not understanding what Mike is saying. I can hear him making that response.
So let me address the agent causation. I have to say I never found agent causation made sense to me, and here's why. I can understand an event causing something, but an agent is like an unchanging object. If someone says like an unchanging object caused something, I think, well, how? I mean, an object, the idea is that an object like a person causes a change in his brain, which then causes some decision. But I think, well, how can a mere object, not a change in an object, not an event, but an object itself bring about an event? I mean, that's just mysterious to me. In addition, it's mysterious to me as to how an agent causation theorist explains why an agent acts at one time rather than another. I mean, his having a thought at T1 explains why he made a certain decision at T2, but just him at T1, I can't understand how that makes him have a decision at T2. Also, acting for a reason seems to me mysterious under agent causation. If a person is just an object, what would make him act for one reason rather than another? A person recognizing an idea or recognizing a justification would explain why he acted for a reason, but the object itself can't explain it. So, well, I think your theory is a powerful one and quite strong. I mean, agent causation just never made any sense to me.
I mean, there's not that much to say it's sort of like it's a fundamental aspect of the world that agents could cause things. And there's not that much to say if somebody just says like, well, how could that be? What if I said, well, how can events cause things? I don't understand. So explain how this thing happening could cause something else happening another time. Or why don't I ask, well, why a change could cause another change? And there's no explanation of that, right? It's just, you just have to have a fundamental concept of causation. But you did raise more specific challenges. So like, okay, well, if the agent is causing it, why did they cause it at a particular time rather than another? And then I suppose that's because they were in the choice situation at that time. So like, you're deciding whether to do A or B, but there's only a particular time at which you're offered the options of doing A or B. But it's not right. Like, we're not exactly saying that the action is caused solely by the agent, right? It's sort of like, well, the agent is what's explaining, the difference between the case where everything is the same, but they did this action, and everything is the same and they did this different action, right? Just like the agent's free choice. But it's not like the agent can just make the choice if there's nothing going on in the world, right? Okay, and then you asked something about, well, how you connect the agent to their reasons. I guess this is something that is discussed in the literature on the agent causation of free will, but I haven't read that, so I don't know what I'm supposed to say about explain action for reasons. But I guess what I want to say is like, well, yeah, like the agent causation view shouldn't be that just the agent plays a role, right? And maybe it's just like, well, the person has certain reasons available to them at a given time. They have options available to them at a particular time. They have reasons for these options at a particular time. But then the agent has to choose between the reasons or something like that, right? So they'll like, the agent will then prefer this reason over this other reason, and then they'll do the action that stemmed from that reason.
Mike, I had this thought. So suppose there's always like a little bit of scope for free will. There are all of these influences. They're very powerful. You've got genes plus environment and that kind of thing. I guess that's all of the influences, genes plus, the environment. And then there's some scope for free will. But what if it's always very small? You say that, okay, free will comes in degrees, but isn't environment plus genes always a really, really powerful influence?
Yeah, is it? What's the evidence for that? So, right. So, okay, well, sounds like an empirical question. There are studies of, studies of people where, I don't know, like they try to track the influence of your environment and also your genes on different outcomes, like whatever your income or your religion or whatever character traits, crime rates or whatever. And it always turns out that there's a huge portion that's unexplained, right? There's they call it, there's like the genetic influence, and then there's shared environment and unshared environment. Okay, but unshared environment actually just means we don't know. It actually just means we can't explain it.
Well, okay, but a lot of that is random chance, circumstance. A lot of that randomness.
It might be, it might be, or it might be free will.
Okay, but presumably at least some of that is randomness, so it's smaller than whatever is left over from genes plus environment. So my point is not to say, there's another worry you might have as a libertarian. There are these hard determinism arguments. There's these anti-responsibility arguments that Steve is pushing, but you might have this other worry, which is I do have this worry, which is, okay, we have free will, but maybe its scope is really, really small. We've got all these other influences, and so turns out we have only really a small amount of freedom to choose. And I actually do kind of think that this is plausible, even on introspection. I feel like my psychological states and the things I tend to think, there does seem to be some freedom there, but it's fairly constrained. There's certain things that are never going to occur to me. There's certain things I'm never going to do or would even consider doing. So it seems like the scope of choice is pretty narrow when you consider all the influences.
Okay, so I mean, there's a few ways of interpreting that. The idea that the scope of our freedom might be limited. So one is, oh, maybe we only have a few free actions, and maybe most of our actions are determined. Or another way of interpreting it is, no, maybe we have a lot of free actions, but we only have a small number of choices, small number of options open to us. Okay. But the other thought is, no, maybe like we have a lot of free choices, but it's sort of like the degree of freedom is lower, because I was suggesting earlier that there could be degrees of freedom, right? And that might be true. So I don't know if animals have freedom. I guess they have either a very low degree of freedom or none. What about children? Like, well, they have lower levels of freedom than adults do, right? Which is why you can punish your kid for being bad, right? But not as much, not as much as you punish an adult, right? They get treated differently, when they commit crimes or stuff like that. Okay, so then, oh well, but like babies don't have free will, right? So it must be increasing as they age and sort of like their brain develops, right? Okay, so then, but then it's possible that like actually even adults don't have that much free will. Like maybe there are higher degrees of freedom that are theoretically possible that most adults don't reach, and that is plausible, actually. I guess it's plausible to me that most people actually just kind of like do what they feel like. So I don't know, and
So
yeah.
I just had a question on sort of understanding. So you seem to say animals have some freedom. I assume we're talking about libertarian freedom. So like, does a Wolverine have like some agent causation, but just like a very like small amount compared to us? Or does a Wolverine lack any agent causation?
I don't know. Hard to get inside the Wolverine's mind, and plus, it's hard to see the metaphysics of it. So, it either has a very low degree of freedom or none.
Do you have any sense of how low on the development of life scale before you get no free will whatsoever? Like all the way down to undergraduates or lower than that even?
Yeah, might go even below undergrads. Like, yeah. Well, this is similar to the question about when consciousness starts, which we don't know. Okay, so it might be that the point at which animals become conscious is also the point at which there's a little bit of freedom, right? Just a little bit.
So at this point in time, I'm a little bit of a loss because I thought freedom was something that like is intricately tied in with responsibility. Wolverine is not responsible on any account. So if someone says, well, a Wolverine has like agent causation, I'm thinking like, well, that's not a responsibility maker. It's not relevant. I mean, do Wolverines like engage in balancing reasons off against one another in any sort of conscious sense? Because if not, I mean, why not think that libertarian free will comes in and only in when you're sort of deciding among different reasons and deciding whether to go with the stronger reason or the weaker reason?
Yeah, so I don't know if the Wolverine has freedom or not, but if it has a little bit of freedom, then it has a little bit of responsibility. Right? And does it deliberate between reasons? I mean, maybe a little bit. It's hard. It's hard to know what the life of a Wolverine is like, really, but they could have competing reasons. I don't know. So, maybe like your dog. The dog wants to eat this thing, but it's not allowed to. So it's going to have these two competing reasons, right? Like not allowed by you. Okay, so it's going to have competing reasons. So maybe it deliberates between them a little bit.
I think I've asked all the questions that are burning in my mind, but Steve, you probably have a few more.
Sorry, I definitely have a few more. And again, real pleasure to be on the show with you guys. So not only do I think that the intuition regarding Patty Hearst is sort of like ultra strong. If someone said immediately after they neural manipulated her, she's responsible, albeit for a small degree, I would just be at a loss to understand how someone could have this intuition. I mean, this is just an off the charts strong intuition to me. Same thing with if if just a normal person had a character and then the choice happened completely disconnected from their character state, and someone said, well, they had a little degree of responsibility, I'd be just completely at a loss. But leaving that aside, I have a separate issue, which is one of the reasons to think that this is true, that people are not responsible, is that it aligns with other things we find when we think about responsibility. And here's what I have in mind. It's called the epistemic condition for blameworthiness. In what makes someone blameworthy? Is it that they're negligent, they don't know what's right, but they should know it? I mean, is that what makes them blameworthy for doing something terrible? Is it they're erratic? They decide, they know what the right thing to do is, they decide to do it, and they don't find to do it? Or are they blameworthy when and only when they know it's wrong and they do it anyway? Presumably in that case, they're negligent because they don't know that they should follow the that morality provides all things considered reasons or overriding reasons. So I just wonder, one reason to think that the no foundation theory is correct is it lines up nicely with the idea that we can't explain what is the attitude that makes someone fundamentally blameworthy.
Yeah. What makes somebody blameworthy? I don't know. So, I mean, I would be tempted to say it's, like the kind of like the Acrasia case, although more precisely, it's that the person had different reasons for action. They acted on the weaker reasons instead of the stronger reasons.
But can we ask, did they know that they were the incorrect reasons? Because if they didn't know they were the incorrect reasons, then they're completely negligent. They wouldn't know it's the incorrect reason. It's hard to blame someone when they didn't know the relevant thing and they didn't know the relevant thing.
Well,
if they knew they should act on the moral reason and they just were too weak, it looks like one of two things is true. Either they didn't know how to ensure that their action aligned with the right reason, that's a negligence failure, or the reason just overpowered what they decided and what they willed, in which case it's like a compulsion.
Yeah. Seems like you're denying free will there, right? So like, you could have a moral reason, and then you could have a selfish reason, and then you could act on the selfish reason, knowing that you shouldn't do it. And it's not that you're overpowered. I mean, like in some sense, you could say you were overpowered. Like the selfish reason you could say was stronger just in virtue of the fact that you're acting on it. But it's not the case that you couldn't have done the other thing, right? And so
well, but if it's Socratic, it's a mystery, right? I mean, you judge, look, I should save the child. I shouldn't go off to work. And then you intend to save the child and go off to work. But then without changing your either your all things considered judgment or your intention, you find yourself rushing off to work. I mean, what could have happened other than some desire kind of overpowered what you both judged and intended? And I don't think this is denying free will, because let me grant, if you even grant the libertarian picture with agent causation is 100% correct, it's still completely unclear to me what is the attitude that makes someone blameworthy. Because I think there's no proper candidate for it, no correct explanation for it, I think no one's blameworthy. And that's true even if we fully accept free will.
Right. So I noticed that you said the attitude that makes somebody blameworthy, but maybe there's no attitude that makes somebody blameworthy. Maybe there's just like a free choice that makes them blameworthy. Right. And then, so there weren't any pre-existing mental states that forced them to make that choice, but just the fact that they made the choice, that's what makes them blameworthy.
Which is one last thing I'll stop. But I mean, look, I mean, you might think the attitude, I mean, what I mean is the free choice, was it made negligently, Socratically, or was it made in full view of the wrongness of what the person did? That is, even if we grant there was a free choice, we can still ask, what was the kind of the failure that led to the blameworthiness?
Yeah, I mean, usually what happens when somebody makes a wrongful choice is they have some degree of awareness that they're acting wrong or something. They have some awareness of the reasons why they should do the other thing. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be wrong. But also, usually they're sort of trying to suppress the awareness. So they're sort of like directing their mind so as to lower their level of awareness of it, to decrease the cognitive dissonance or something, right? But that doesn't excuse you, right? You don't get out of it that easily. And I feel like we should discuss the fact that determinism is self-defeating.
The fact that it's self-defeating, yes.
Yeah, we should discuss that.
I'm sorry, I don't find that a plausible argument, because if determinism is true, we're going to end up explaining epistemology in a certain way that doesn't rely on free will. It's going to be reliabilist or something. It's going to be true that certain ways of reasoning are more likely to be, result in true beliefs. Okay, so basically, just as we can have evaluations of states of affairs, even if hard determinism is true, and the soft determinists will want to try to make room for like a consequentialist ethics, at least, even if determinism is true. I mean, you could say something similar about the epistemic side of things. Like, it's still the case that beliefs formed on the basis of evidence are more likely to be true. And so,
well, but so what, right? Because on this view, right, there's no fact that you should pursue the truth. So why do you care that the beliefs based on evidence are more likely to be true? That's irrelevant.
It could be good that you believe true things, and it'll be this. You'll be squeezing more out of the evaluative. A lot of our deontic, maybe all of our deontic evaluations are going to turn out to be just purely evaluative.
I mean, see, it would be fine if you had a consequentialist view. Or, maybe it's not completely fine. There'd be objections to this, but anyway, you have a consequentialist view. You can still explain why you should believe something rather than another. But no, this isn't the consequentialist view we're talking about, right? And they can't get back ethics either, right? They can't have a consequentialist ethics or a utilitarian ethics, because there's no reason to pursue the good consequences. it's not true that you should pursue good consequences, that you should maximize the good or anything like that. Right? So it could be true that it would be good if you had these beliefs, but it wouldn't be true that you should form these beliefs. It wouldn't be true that you should accept this argument, or you should avoid contradicting yourself, or any of that, right? None of that would be true, right? And my claim is that, well, those sorts of judgments about what you should think, how you should think, those are just inherent in rational discourse and deliberation.
But what I'm suggesting is that perhaps there's a modest conceptual revision that has to happen. Maybe it's like a mild error theory. We're not just throwing out all moral concepts altogether, but maybe deontic concepts in the sense that they seem to be distinct from the evaluative in a certain way. Maybe that's revisable, right? Maybe it could be that we think that there's like reasonableness of beliefs that's different than just the likelihood of getting it right or something like that. And the hard determinist might say, well, we're going to have to revise our epistemic concepts a bit in light of the true theory about the free will debate. But that doesn't make it self-defeating. I think they're going to say something like that.
But I mean, what do you mean a bit? Like, it seems like it's a completely radical revision.
Can I just say about the radical? I think we've already started down the path of radical revision and responsibility. I mean, it's fairly recently that people have been beginning to think that people are not blameworthy for negligence. Fairly recently that people think they're not blameworthy for acrosia, at least in the sort of become increasingly common in the literature. So in support of what Spencer's saying, we've already started to really revise our view of responsibility. Why wouldn't this be even just a more of that?
Okay, wait, I don't think that I've started on those revisions, right? So I'm not accepting that people are not responsible for acrosia.
What about negligence? You think people are basically blameworthy for negligent acts?
Yeah, of course. Like, what do you mean? Like, you get whatever, you get sued, if you were negligent, then you have to pay. And if you weren't negligent, then you don't have to pay, right?
Yeah, but I mean, look, if we had a purely justice-based account of tort law, it would be strict liability. It wouldn't be negligence-based, right? The case for negligence is efficiency-based. I mean, that's all law and econ types like negligence. Whereas, justice types, the Nozickian types, which kind of you and I used to be, I mean, they seem to be much more open to strict liability. They think, look, you trash someone's property. Who cares whether you're at fault?
What? Wait. I mean, I would have thought that the people who are interested in justice would say, like, of course it matters if you're responsible, because, like, if you weren't negligent, then it wasn't your fault. So why do you have to pay for something that wasn't your fault? It was just like an act of nature or something like that.
Hamilton versus Jenner. I mean, imagine you have someone driving around and suddenly a bolt out of the blue, the person has an epileptic attack. So she loses control of her car and it goes off the road and smashes into someone's house and damages the person's, bicycle shop and the house. I don't remember the exact facts of the case, and even breaks the person's leg. You might think, well, look, because the person caused harm, she should have to compensate the victim, but she's not blameworthy in any way. I mean, a bolt out of the blue epileptic attack, let's just say for which was not true, but imagine this was her first epileptic attack. That's not something for which she can be blameworthy, and yet it seems plausible that she should have to pay for it. In the same way that if you're using Noah's example, if you're at the bottom of the well and someone throws a small man down at you, you can shoot that person with a ray gun, even though he's not at fault for endangering your life.
Yeah, but the reason why you're shooting him is not to punish him. It's to stop yourself from being killed.
Right, and that's what I'm talking about tort law. When we're not punishing people, we're just requiring compensation. For self-defense, where we're just requiring a defensive act.
Right, but like when you get the compensation, like that's not preventing the bad thing from happening. So yeah, well, okay, it's not clear to me whether that person has to pay or not. Okay, but I think the justification for strict liability has to do with responsibility. So in cases where strict liability seems appropriate, it's because the person was doing something that was inherently dangerous or something like that, where they had a choice to have not done the inherently dangerous thing, right? Once they had decided to do the inherently dangerous thing, then maybe they didn't have control over whether a bad outcome happened. But that's why it would become just to hold them responsible. Or at least that's how I've understood it up till now, right?
I mean, that's how the law works. I just don't think that's how morality works. I mean, I think the reason is because your property caused it. I mean, take the woman who had the epileptic fit. I mean, she's not in fault in any way, but you might think it's fair to compensate and make her compensate the house owner. And think the person who uses the ray gun at the small man has been thrown down the well. The small man has done nothing, is not at fault, has 0 degree of fault, and yet it seems that he forfeits a right. So if you can forfeit a right regarding self-defense, it's not clear why you can't forfeit a right regarding compensation.
Wasn't it a fat man? Are you being politically correct, Steve?
I am being politically correct. I actually think, I mean, it's been a while since I read the example. I think it's actually a midget or a dwarf, but I can't remember. So I am being politically correct. And I apologize because I'm with two, two fellows enemies of wokeness, but it's not my podcast. I was trying to be polite.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this is aptly described in terms of forfeiting a right. I get that just kind of strikes me as odd that he forfeited his right to life by somebody throwing him. Anyway.
He forfeited right because the way you can see it is the person shooting him does not have to offer an apology, nor if he miraculously lives, albeit in highly damaged form, does he have to compensate him. So if the small man, retains his right, then he would have to. Then the person at the bottom of the well would owe either compensation or an apology.
Well, okay, I'm not convinced that he doesn't owe him an apology or compensation. So, right, and I don't think that we're going to figure out anything by talking about this case because I don't think this is a clear case. So I think we're not we shouldn't try to figure out the obscure by talking about something more obscure that's, more controversial. Okay, how did we get on that? Talking about conditions for compensation. Yeah, you have to be responsible for something in order to owe compensation for it. I would have thought yes, but I don't know. Okay, so suppose you think you don't have to be responsible for a thing in order to owe compensation for it. So then, where were we going to go from there?
Well, so that tells us that rights can do a lot of the work if we think that rights can exist independent of responsibility. Now, that's going to be a deeper issue, but it tells us that a lot of our intuitions can be justified by rights without respect to responsibility. But I'm kind of curious here, just a kind of a simpler question. Are you yourself a non-consequentialist or rights believer, or you're a consequentialist? And the reason I'm asking is because your arguments, a lot of the ones for responsibility, are like we shouldn't punish innocents, to prevent, vast rioting. And that seems right if we're non-consequentialists. But if we're consequentialists, that's not a good reason.
Yeah. So, well, I'm not a consequentialist, but sometimes I'm sympathetic to rule utilitarianism, which I gather the real utilitarians do not consider to be a form of consequentialism. So, do not consider legitimate consequentialism. So, right. Yeah. So I think a lot of the norms that we have, like norms about what rights people have, are best explained in terms of, well, what system of social rules would have the best consequences or something like that. And like the reason why I'm sympathetic to this is just that it seems like it does a reasonably good job of explaining, a bunch of normative judgments about particular cases, right? But I'm not saying that I know that. Like, I don't know that that's right, but whatever. It seems reasonable.
If you're a rule consequentialist, then why would this show that you don't need responsibility? So as long as assuming determinism's false, why couldn't you say, well, I'm a rule consequentialist, and then we don't need responsibility? We can just rely on what maximizes the good.
Well, but I mean, like a basic background condition for something to be a thing that you should do is that you're capable of doing it and you're capable of not doing it. Like any ethical theory, whatever it is supposed to tell you how to choose among the options. How should we rank the options that are available to us or something like that? But, on determinism, there are no options. So there's no room for having an ethical theory. And yeah, I don't get how you're supposed to have ethics or normative epistemology if you don't have anything that you should do, right? There's no shoulds. They're just things that are good or bad, but they just happen or don't happen. It would be like acts of nature, right? It's just like, a tornado hit. That was bad. But like, there's nothing ethical to say about it because nobody did it, right? Assuming there's no God, nobody did it. Nobody could have stopped it. So just like, okay, let's just stop happening. And like, that's how our beliefs would be, if determinism is true. We just have to say, yeah, no, they're forming beliefs. Oh, too bad the beliefs were that way, but there isn't really anything to say by way of recommendation, right?
I don't think I could get any credit for this podcast being a real banger, because how could it have failed to have been awesome with you two as my guests, So this has been fantastic. Any closing thoughts from anyone?
I don't know. Don't be insane. Why do we have so many philosophers with so many insane views? Like, can't you be, reasonable and commonsensical?
That advice has always served me well.
And on my closing comment is, look, without a responsibility foundation, you don't get responsibility.
Oh, that's succinct. I like that closing statement.
I don't understand how free will works. I don't understand a lot of stuff about the world. I don't understand why there's consciousness at all, or why there is free will, and I really understand how it works. But I feel like I should believe in it, even if I don't totally understand how it works, right? Because of the stuff that I was saying and how central it is to our belief system and so on. You don't have to understand everything about how something works to believe in it.
Mike and I are pretty similar in that way. I mean, I think we don't understand how free will works whatsoever, and that's one of the reasons I reject it. I think it's mysterious and contradictory, and so I don't want to cut it any slack. But maybe I should. I mean, but yeah. So we agree that I don't understand how free will works either.
Yeah.